Hello, I recently spoke to Ben Shapiro on my Luminary podcast, Under the Skin, which is available on Luminary, the app, and on Apple. If you want to get the rest of this conversation, go over to Luminary or Apple and subscribe to Luminary, where all my episodes of Under the Skin, as well as Dave Chappelle's podcast and countless other brilliant subscription model podcasts, are available to you. In this conversation, Ben Shapiro and I talked about a wide range of cultural issues, and people that are interested in hearing conversations with people with differing views, I think will enjoy this conversation. I also went on to Ben's show to continue this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. Like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell. If you want to listen to the rest of it, remember, over to Luminary or Apple to subscribe. The link is in the description. Ben, thank you for joining me on Under the Skin.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you.
Well, I appreciate that. Back at you.
This is, I suppose, a peculiar time for us to be having a conversation, sort of culturally, geopolitically. You've probably got I watch a lot of your content, as I said just in our brief chat before, and I'm sure you, even if you don't watch my content, and I would never assume, I imagine you sort of know who I am. So how do you generally approach conversations with people where there is an assumption that we're on across some real or imagined cultural line? Does it make any particular difference to you?
Only in the sense that I like to actually, read about or at least watch some of your stuff so that I know kind of how you approach interviews, because some people have a different approach, and I've had experiences in the past that have gone quite viral in which I had no idea what the interview was going to be, and then it goes sideways. And so you always want to know kind of what you're walking into. But aside from that, I don't care at all. I speak with people who disagree with me on a regular basis, and frankly, I kind of find it more fun. It's more interesting.
I suppose you're referring with the misstep with Andrew Neil. One of the things that I admire about you is your deftness and ability to handle confrontational conversations. Piers Morgan, another Englishman that I've seen you with. But it's amusing for English people to watch you with Andrew Neil, because we're all thinking, this dude is conservative, he's the editor of the Sunday Times, and that's the...
I'll be honest, dude, I had no clue who he was, which is clearly obvious. And as I said, even before the interview came out, I was tweeting about how he kicked my ass, and that was because he did. I mean, I had no idea who he was. The interview was booked, and it was booked by my publisher, and they were like, "Yeah, some guy on the BBC." I'm like, "Okay, I don't really watch the BBC. I'm from America." And then he started questioning me, and I didn't know anything about his interview style, which of course is very aggressive, and he likes to play devil's advocate, and so about 15 minutes into the interview, when he was just kind of reading my old tweets at me, and I was like, "I'm out." I still had no idea who he was. Then I looked him up, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I probably should have researched who he was. My mistake."
Yeah. You probably get on all right with him. I've never met Andrew Neil, but he's a serious broadcaster. One of the areas where I reckon you and I perhaps have a lot in common, obviously, we've both got families. I feel your family's pretty young, and also you believe in God, and you're a pretty religious man, hey?
Yeah. So we're Orthodox Jews. My wife and I are both Orthodox. We raise our kids Orthodox. My family became Orthodox when I was maybe 11. We were always very interested in religious Judaism, but we became fully kosher, eating kosher food and not driving on Sabbath and such when I was about 11 years old. So I've been doing that since then, and I find great solace and comfort and virtue in my religion, and hopefully that comes out in how I raise my kids.
How do you find solace? And aside from the observances and protocols around Orthodox Judaism, how does it affect your outlook and interactions, particularly, I suppose, as a polemicist and a highly regarded and widely followed orator? How does it affect you there? I suppose the intersection between your religious faith and your political views and your
political I mean, in terms of sort of how it works in my personal life, I mean, I would say that religion provides me the opportunity to constantly be stepping outside of whatever is sort of the daily news cycle. If religion is supposed to be eternal, then the idea that there is an eternity in which this is just one moment, and that you can step away for a moment from Twitter, and the world won't end, and the world will continue to spin. And there are people before you who have known more than you. There are people who are after you who will know more than you, presumably. And there's a God above you who also knows a lot more than any of those people is definitely comforting. For a lot of Jews, and for me particularly, Sabbath is a big deal. being able to physically turn off all electronic devices and not be connected at all to the news starting Friday night, ending Saturday night is a huge thing, because I'm sure virtually everybody feels now, if I'm at dinner with my kids on a weeknight, the temptation to reach into your pocket and just start scrolling the news or checking your emails is really high. Well, on Sabbath, everything shuts off. And so it's kind of a wonderful way to reconnect with family. It's a way to reconnect with religion. You go to synagogue for a couple of hours. You spend some time contemplating your place in the universe and contemplating what you think God requires of you. And it really kind of regrounds you. In terms of what I think Judaism provides me in terms of values, I'm a big believer that much of Enlightenment philosophy is rooted in certain unspoken assumptions about the world, about the nature of truth, about the nature of the human mind to understand broader objective truths, and that those ideas spring from a Judeo-Christian worldview historically in the West.
Wow. When you I can see this, how the practical application of a Sabbath and the ability to cut off from tech and create a period of contemplation, particularly now the tendrils of cultural life have bled into so much of domesticity, like that, I can see that would be a boon, a benefit. And in fact, in my own life, I'm continually having to create those kind of spaces. I essentially live a secularized version of a religious life. I believe in God, but I'm a 12-step person, and that means that, obviously I'm abstinent from drugs and alcohol, but also other sort of behavioral addictions. I have a lot of protocols around, and increasingly I think that the tech experience has become so ubiquitous that everyone will have to have some kind of conscious plan around tech, or risk having your consciousness kind of blended, even if that's not in a sort of a literal Elon Musk Neuralink way, with kind of the incentives and imperatives of whoever is most dominant in that field. Is that something you feel?
100% agree. I totally agree with this. I mean, so much so that, Twitter used to be on my phone. I removed Twitter from my phone because really for people in public life, Twitter is sort of an ego machine, because it's not just that you're tweeting things out into the ether. You're always constantly checking your your incoming messages and how people are responding to you. And it creates a real sort of echo chamber of people who are talking about you all the time, which is the most unhealthy thing you can have. Is you thinking you're the center of the universe is pretty much the worst thing as a human being that you can think. And so the internet tends to do that to you. Or alternatively, you felt frozen out of the center of the universe. And so you feel like you're on the periphery, which is bad in very, very different ways. And so kind of turning off and being with people is a really important thing. And you find that, I've said to my wife before, I'll come home on a given day and she'll say, "How's your day?" I'll say, "Well, I didn't trend on Twitter, so it was a good day." And increasingly, what I found is that even though I do trend on Twitter probably once every 3 weeks or so, it can still be a good day as soon as I turn off Twitter, because there is this real world out there where nobody who is around you is spending their day on Twitter following you. So you're thinking about yourself a lot, but nobody else really is. And recognizing that not everybody is thinking about you, I think, is the sign of a healthy mind.
Yeah, that's a kind of perhaps analogous to how culture can operate more broadly. That it can, as you have said, it can make you feel included or even centrifugal, or it can make you feel banished and an outcast. You mentioned in your on the Sabbath, one of the things you contemplate what God wants from you. Would you share with me and us, of course, what kind of revelations you get? And I'm not trying to paint you as like a religious zealot or anything.
I'm not a person who thinks that God speaks to me. I tend to be much more of a rationalist with regard to religion, sort of a Thomistic or Maimonidean religious approach. So everything.
Would you explain those terms to me?
So Thomistic meaning Thomas Aquinas, or Maimonidean meaning Rambam in Hebrew, Maimonides. So these are two philosophers who attempt to essentially merge a lot of Aristotelian ideas about how the world works with religious thought. So the idea is there's a basic logic to the universe, that you don't see God in miracles as much as you see God in the everyday workings of nature and the way that the world works around you, and that there are certain laws of how to live a healthy life that can be discerned from the natural world around you. This is the idea of natural law, as sort of recapitulated. Historically speaking, natural law was an idea that was very prevalent in ancient Greece. Aristotle talks about this, and then that sort of philosophy disappeared for a long time, and it was rediscovered around the year 1000. And so that kind of created this religious reawakening, because the Christian world started to integrate that via Thomas Aquinas. The Jewish world started to do that via Maimonides. The Islamic world even actually at that time started to do that via people like Al-Farabi. And then the idea was, how can you balance reason and revelation? And what Maimonides and Aquinas basically said is that the way that you balance those things is by suggesting that there are rational reasons for the commandments that are given via revelation, for example. So when I'm reading the Bible every Saturday, what I'm searching for is ancient wisdom that applies to me and that has roots in deeper truths. Because one of the things that I believe, and this goes to some of my political conservatism as well, but certainly my sort of religious conservatism, one of the things that I believe is if things have stuck around for several thousand years, not always, but very often, there's a good reason they've stuck around for several thousand years. There's a famous G.K. Chesterton quote that I think really sums this up, where I'll paraphrase it because I'm not going to quote it properly, but the basic idea is that the difference between somebody who is conservative in orientation versus somebody who is not is somebody who's conservative in orientation. He walks across a field, he sees a wall in the middle of the field, and he can't understand why there's a wall in the middle of the field. And his first move is to think, okay, why is the wall there? Who built this wall? Was it built there for any good purpose? Whereas if you're not of conservative orientation, very often you look at the wall, you see that it's not there for any good reason that you can see, and you immediately dismantle the wall. And it's only later you find out that maybe the wall needed to be there, or maybe we needed to build the wall in a different place. But that's sort of my view on biblical revelation, is you look there for eternal human truths, and then you attempt to use human logic to suss that out. Because if God is giving any sort of revelation to humanity, or if God is attempting to speak to humanity through the Bible, he's speaking in language that we can understand. He understands we're going to apply our own reason that he gave us to the words of the Bible.
Do you find it applicable in your actual daily life, though? I can see that you have a deep and broad understanding of theological principles from a variety of disciplines. But in this period of contemplation of 24 hours, do you ever have cause to think, am I Ben Shapiro on the right path as a father and as a professional man, and do you ever feel an intimate and meaningful connection? You're doing a really good job, in my view, of navigating that difficult territory that exists in mysticism, which I guess we would have to say religion could be referred to as broadly, and these principles that tether it to rationalism, so that we can't just dismiss mysticism. And I'm sure that the results of diminishing the role of religion in cultural life is probably something where you and I would have a lot of common ground. The creation of nihilism, materialism, commodification. I bet that we agree on loads of stuff there. I wonder, though, how your personal ethics are impacted. Can you think of an example of how you would have moderated your own behavior as a result of something that's touched you biblically?
So, I mean, I think that religion, especially if you grow up with it, is something that sort of exists at the baseline of the iceberg that is your life. You're living most of your life at the top of the iceberg, but most of your values live underneath the water, and so you don't really examine them all that often. I think that in my daily practice, you're supposed to pray 3 times daily as a Jew. You pray in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening. I'll admit I am not very good at prayer. I tend to be very impatient, and I tend to kind of rush through prayers more often than I should, for sure. But the goal is that you're going to take out in the mornings 25 minutes, and then in the afternoons and the evenings, maybe 10 minutes apiece, to actually sit there and think about your life and try and reevaluate, the day, what you're doing wrong, what you're doing right. And as far as raising my kids, that I do end up thinking about a lot, because kids, as you know, ask you all sorts of difficult questions that sort of force you to rethink a lot of the things that you've thought about. And so I've got a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And so my 7-year-old and 5-year-old are at the ages where they start to ask really kind of interesting theological questions, right? They're starting to ask things like, what happens after you die? And in really kind of interesting and fun ways. Right? So my 5-year-old son turned to my wife and said the other day, and he said, so after you die, what happens to you? And she said, well, you don't have a body anymore. You're kind of liberated from your body. And he said, what did that mean? Do you fly around? And she said, no, you don't really fly around. It's not like you have wings or something. He said, okay, so what exactly does that mean? And trying to boil down sort of the idea of reunification with a higher being to a 5-year-old makes for a really interesting conversation. Trying to explain what makes you is really interesting and forces you to think about it more deeply. And sometimes you don't have all the answers. And there, I think that the best thing that you can do, and this is true in most versions of everything, and this is a lesson where when I fail to learn it, you get smacked by life, is acknowledging when you don't know something. I mean, that to go back to the BBC interview, if I don't know something, I would be better off just saying, I really don't know who you are and I don't know much about this interview, rather than trying to kind of bull my way through it. And the same thing is true in a wide variety of areas in life. Every time you get arrogant and you think that you know something, life is going to punish you for that.
Yes, I've found this to be true. I can see how like, quickly in the conversation with the kids, you can end up dealing with things like essence, the nature of consciousness. I was trying to think how I would handle that. My children are 3 and 5. She's going to be 5 in a little while, and already it's pretty easy to drop into the lower part of that iceberg and to see what underwrites the limited bandwidth of ordinary egoic everyday consciousness. You can be brought there quite quickly, quite swiftly by a child's interrogation.
For sure. And my son asked, so what makes he got into, so what am I, right? If I'm not my body. And I said, well, if God forbid you were to lose a hand, you'd still be you, right? He said, yeah. I said, and if you were to lose a foot, you'd still be you. So your body really isn't you in terms of your soul, right? There's a part of you that is a conscious ability to choose. That is I didn't use exactly those words because he's 5. But you have the ability to do the right thing or do the wrong thing. And that part of you is really not connected to your body. There's something special about you that God implanted in you and that you'll return to God after you die. And this he sort of understood. But it's not that it's not a sad. Speaking about death to children is always a really, you don't want to give them nightmares. And at the same time, they're asking very deep and abiding questions that require answers.
Yeah, I approach it in the same way. I'm plain about the idea of death, of finality, and I've tried not to make it, gory or gruesome or overly sentimentalize it. But we found like a dead mole in the garden, and my daughter was just so fascinated with it. We gave it a burial, but she, I'm afraid to admit, exhumed that mole a further 3 times to re-engage with the corpse, with the mole less and less cute on each subsequent visit. But I don't want her to be sort of squeamish about life. Hey, don't you find are all your children boys or male?
I know. So it goes girl, boy, girl.
Do you find like anything in the kind of stuff that I've watched you analyze and critique around the culture wars, where you feel like empowerment of females and like for example, myself, right? Like sometimes when I say I watch a movie and I see even a kind of a trivial joke about boys saying something like, oh, girls, they're rubbish, and I'm watching that with my kids, I feel like furious. Like, how dare you say that? I don't want that going into my daughter, right? So even though there are many things that you have said that I would agree with on lots and lots of subjects, that's one of the reasons that I want to talk to you. One of the areas where I thought that would be interesting for us to discuss is, do you not sometimes find things that are being talked about by, e.g., trans community, feminist community, that you think have value and worth when it comes to individuals being, what I want to say, sort of acknowledged, heard, honored, perhaps even?
So the idea that you should be, acknowledged for your feelings particularly depends on whether I think that the feelings are rooted in something good or something bad, right? Your children are constantly doing things that you don't want them to do, and you're constantly telling them not to do them, right? Your job as a parent is to help guide them through the world. In terms of valuable things that feminism has done for girls and women, I mean, I'm fully cognizant of that. My wife, as I've said many times, is a doctor. When I was growing up, my mom worked and my dad stayed home. My daughter happens to be incredibly bright, and I hope that she picks the career that she wants and is able to do exactly what she wants. And we try to foster that in everything that she does. That anything that a boy can do in terms of picking a career, you can do. Although she is fully aware that that typically there are certain things physically where women are different than men, right? Girls have babies and boys don't have babies, and men pick up heavy objects and are dumb. This is what she knows about boys. So this is, which again is not a bad thing for her to know. But the idea that the women are not relegated to their biology alone in terms of what they can do for a career, of course, I think is very much true. And I have no objection to that at all. What I do have objection to is the idea that there are no fundamental differences between men and women, that there is no difference that can be named between a boy and a girl, that I would, for example, have to not be able to say I have a girl, a boy, a girl. I'd have to say I have children of unspecified gender until they reach the age at which they pick their gender, which theoretically could change all the way until the time they become a dead mole. There I have serious objections, and I'm not going to either confuse my kids with that notion or promulgate that falsity to them. And I think that it's important to reinstill certain realities about their biology and note that to my son that he is a boy, and to my daughter that she is a girl. And if she wants to be a tomboy and be a girl, that's fine. And if my son, is a little bit more effeminate and he's a boy, he's still a boy. There are certainly characteristics that where boys can, have non-traditional male interests, and that's fine. And girls can have non-traditional female interests, and that's fine too. I don't have any problem with that. Where I draw the line is where people start to suggest there are no fundamental differences between boys and girls, which if you have boys and girls as children, is not true. Or if you live in the world and have ever met either a man or a woman, seem fundamentally untrue.
Do you think that, not dealing with, I'm not talking about individuals here, I'm talking about the way that the media is mobilized around these issues. Do you think that there is something fundamentally disingenuous? Do you think that they have an agenda or objectives beyond the protection of people's rights to express themselves however they want to identify however they want to feel that they are accepted by a culture, all of which to me seem like perfectly reasonable objectives for any individual? Do you feel that there are secondary or ulterior agenda that are being pursued culturally that cause you some kind of disease other than a kind of the sort of what you've just asserted ideologically about your interpretation, understanding of what you would just say is absolute biology?
Yeah, so I mean there are a few things. So one is there's a great book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman that I think is well worth reading on this particular subject. There's been a redefinition. It really doesn't start with transgenderism or even the modern era. A redefinition of what it means to be an individual and where you get your individuality, what makes you, right? What is your identity about? For most of human history, your identity was about you living within the boundaries of a particular community. How you interacted with the world was part of what shaped your identity. How you interacted with your community was part of how you shaped your identity. If you read Aristotle, it's all about producing good citizens in the polis, for example. Or if you read the Founding Fathers, they're talking about how to live within your community and the importance of communal bonds. And as communal bonds have sort of broken down, and I think that this relationship is sort of symbiotic, as our version of what identity has changed, people have stopped associating what I am with what society expects of me. What are the rules of society and how do I interact with those rules of society? And instead they've said, I am what I feel, right? My authenticity is key. Authenticity is the thing that matters the most. It doesn't matter whether there's no good or there's no bad, there's just authenticity. And the rules of the road have to be changed around me in order to foster my own sense of authenticity, which means everybody else has to change their behavior because I feel a particular way. Well, that to me is not a way to build a society. I'm not sure that you can build a society in which everyone's individual identity is rooted in forcing everybody else to change their ideas about the world and how they wish to address the world. That doesn't seem like a smart way to do it. If you can't have any sort of at all mutually agreed rules of the road, other than presumably just saying yes to everything, it's going to be very difficult to build a society around anything like that. I mean, that's on a very abstract level. On a more practical level, one of the things that you've seen in the United States, for example, is an attempt to tell religious Americans that if they don't raise their children with particular values, then they're doing abuse to their children, and that presumably the state should step in. You've seen bakers who have been sued for saying, I don't wish to participate in this particular activity. Right now, I'm very libertarian when it comes to this stuff. I feel that freedom includes freedom of association, and freedom of association means that people I don't like can not associate with me. That is their choice. I'm fully libertarian on this to the point where if somebody wants to not have Jews in their business, I think they're a bad person. But I think that they should be free to do that because, frankly, I don't want any overarching authority telling people who they must and can associate with. That seems to me more dangerous. But there is an outright attempt to change the nature of language, to make it so that we can't agree on even simple terminology, to make language entirely subjective, which makes it very difficult to talk to one another, to turn every political problem into an identity problem. So we, instead of having a discussion about, for example, what is the proper treatment for gender dysphoria, instead it turns into you're attacking my identity if you disagree with me about the proper treatment for gender dysphoria. Well, what if I'm just arguing about what's the proper treatment for gender dysphoria based on the data? Or what if I'm just discussing the differences biologically between males and females? That's not an attack on your identity, but the conflation of everything that I believe and everything that I feel internally on a subjective level with who I am is a it's very difficult to see how you reach common ground there. You need to be at least able to put yourself out of the conversation enough to discuss things in a mutual space where the terminology is agreed upon.
When you discuss your own certainty around your Judaism and Orthodoxy, and your and then sort of outline your critique of some of these somewhat modern cultural phenomena, but perhaps abiding phenomena more broadly, even if the kind of emphasis and the discourse wasn't granted. Do you feel perhaps that there are fissures appearing culturally that can't ever really be abridged, and that possibly the best kind of solution might be that a kind of a confederacy of like, well, people just live how you want to live, and allow other people to live how they want to live, which I can see that somewhat within the remit of libertarianism.
Yeah, I mean, I've said for a long time that I think that this is the direction in which we're moving. The question is, are we going to share a culture or not? Because that libertarianism only lasts as long as nobody grabs the gun at the top of the food chain, right? I mean, whoever controls the gun controls the policy, unfortunately. And when I say the gun, I just mean the government, because the government to me is just a giant machine for compulsion. That's in essence what the government is designed to do. Every law at the very end of the road is backed by some guy coming to your door with a gun and putting you in jail if you don't obey the law. So it depends on whether there can be a common agreement to leave people alone. And I think that agreement is pretty much what is missing right now. If you are an adult and you choose to live however you want to live and you're not bothering me, I may disagree with what you do. I may think that what you're doing is religiously sinful. I may think that on a non-religious level, you are living a dissolute life and that you could be doing better with your life. But I also understand that you're an adult and you have the capacity to build your own life. If you can't understand the same about me, then we've got a problem, because then we don't have a shared space at all. Then it's just a matter of who wins, right? Then it's not a matter of we can have an agreement to leave each other alone, which frankly, my ideal life is just to be left alone. This seems great to me. But if there can't be that sort of fundamental agreement, then there will just be this continuing war of all against all. And then the question just becomes who wins that war.
Because I don't think that war can be won either, Ben. I've been thinking about it a lot, man. And like I sort of, when I think about conservatism, republicanism, sort of like the, Enlightenment informed type of politics that led to the foundation of your country, the challenge I have with it sort of in some ways sounds oddly comparable to some of the criticisms you've offered about other enclaves of culture and identity, is that for me it seems that conservatism becomes too easily alloyed with concentration of power. It facilitates and expedites the progress of powerful interests and institutions. It leads to inaccessible and fortified power centers, for me more in the financial and corporate world rather than the sort of the world of state and government. Not that I'm a big state person either, by the way. So I've often, like the same way I guess you're probably called a fascist, and with the obvious ironies, acknowledged in referring to you with that loaded word. I'm kind of sometimes called a communist, and I think, well, I don't believe that there should be centralized state power at all. That's something I really strongly disavow. If anything, I'm trying to find some fusion between anarchism in a literal sense, i.e. some sort of small collectives that are democratically run, and libertarianism, where the rights of the individual are honoured. And it seems to me that both of those ideas would require, who knows how we get to this utopia, Ben, but even in raising it, it seems to me that isn't it worth at least addressing the flaws within the kind of conservatism for which you are such an outspoken and admired as orator? Like, for example, the way that you support, like, you must surely have had an uneasy relationship with Trump because of the kind of perhaps the ethical and moral concerns around Trump, but because he was like the Republican guy, and I find him like a fascinating figure, and I felt like a lot of the critiques and attacks on Trump were revealing about the real conservatism being within the neoliberal domain now, that neoliberalism abandoned its commitment to working class people of any colour in favour of cultural politics that, which I've had explained to me, has no real impact on true power centres creates division and conflict on both sides and enables the powerful to continue to pursue their interests. I suppose amidst this storm of language, Ben, what I'm saying is what kind of doubts and concerns do you have about conservatism and republicanism? Where do you see there being room for change from what you would refer to mostly derisively on your show as the left? Can you give me some stuff out of that hurricane?
I think that one of the big problems with conservatism is that conservatism, in sort of the traditional American sense, which looks more like classical liberalism in the European sense, it's rooted in a certain fundamental assumption about the values that are going to be held by the community. And if those values fall away, then the institutions themselves are not going to be enough to protect the citizenry, right? This is something that John Adams noted very early on. He said that the Constitution of the United States was made only for moral and religious people. If the people became no longer moral or religious, then they would move right through the boundaries of the Constitution like a whale would through a net, right? So there are certain unspoken assumptions about the nature of community life. And if you read de Tocqueville very early on, he talks about how in the United States, people are constantly forming social organizations, associations. They're going to church a lot. They're interacting with each other a lot. They're building communities, strong communities with real social fabric. And that replaces the sort of government compulsion that otherwise you would need in order to provide for law and order. Right? There's a lot of social pressure not to break the law. There's a lot of social pressure not to be rude or impolite. There's a lot of social pressure to do all of these things. And if people stop acting that way, then government compulsion is suddenly looking a lot more attractive, because as things disintegrate, people want the government to do all the things that society used to do, and government starts to fill that gap. So that's been a problem with conservatism. And you're seeing that kind of breakdown within conservatism, even with this sort of debate that's happening right now between a sort of libertarianish conservative wing and a more interventionist conservative wing. People who think that the government actually should replace a lot of those social institutions in cramming down particular social values, attempting to restore social fabric from the top down, which I frankly don't think is possible. You know, when you talk about centralization of power in institutions, Russell, I kind of want to know how the power was centralized and what the power is being used to do. So whenever I hear centralized power, it sort of depends to me on what is being traded away in return for the centralized power. So when I look at government, I see centralized power in government. I understand that you're trading away your rights to the government, presumably in exchange for a certain level of protection. And I have serious objections to that, because those rights belong to me. They are inalienable under our Declaration. And I think according to natural rights theory. So government scares me. When it comes to corporations, the question is, how are they gaining that power? So if a corporation got really big, because the corporation has a hand-in-glove relationship with the government, and the government is there's regulatory capture. The government is creating regulations specifically to quash the competitors of this particular giant corporation. Or the corporation is working in cahoots with the government to write the rules in such a way that it makes it pretty much unpalatable for anybody to get into that business. That, to me, is deeply scary, right? When the Occupy Wall Street movement started in the United States, my big problem with the Occupy Wall Street movement is I wasn't sure why they were occupying Wall Street as opposed to occupying D.C., considering that D.C. has the power of the purse and the power of the gun. You know, Wall Street is just a bunch of businesses. So that's one arena of centralized power. The other arena of centralized power is just businesses getting bigger because they are good at what they do. And I don't have a problem with businesses getting bigger because they are good at what they do, or operating in a free market space in order to negotiate, for example, with labor. Nor, by the way, do I have a problem with private labor organizing in opposition to businesses, so long as they're not kneecapping people who wish to work for a lower wage. My problem with centralized power when it comes to corporate world is that centralized power in the corporate world very often involves hand-in-glove relationships with the compulsory power of the government, enshrining these corporations permanently at the top of the hierarchy, and that I have a real problem with.
Perhaps it's inevitable that at the elite levels, these kind of relationships are abiding, that there is that you cannot attain that degree of influence. And for a definition of power, a very simple one I heard, is the ability to reward people who align with your interests and punish people who do not. And on that basis, we can see that there are certainly powerful emergent forces in the world of tech that are centralized, that are able to a degree, it seems at least, moderate themselves, decide who can use their platforms in what way. But the reason, one of the sort of real fundamental and, so rudimentary, it's almost childlike queries that I have about the way that you conduct your channel, and is that when you refer to the left as kind of Marxist and extreme leftist, I feel like, Well, they don't seem like they're on the left at all, as I've understood the left, i.e. the left about redistribution of resources, the empowerment of ordinary people, in the case obviously of your country, ordinary Americans of all colours and creeds, having the ability to have power in their own lives, free from cultural or political or economic imposition. This for me is the role of a true opposition party, however you want to colour it. And one of the other issues I wanted to bring to you is it seems to me that there is now a kind of dissipation of these systems of categorization. Within the Republicans, you've said there's that libertarian sort of post-Tea Party type of republicanism, post-Trump, well, God knows what it looks like now, and with the sort of traditional sort of Christian right that it exists loosely corralled into that. And with the left, my biggest sort of concern about leftist politics is that there is no agenda to reorganize society beyond certain cultural inflections, which you spend a lot of your time critiquing and are doubtlessly having a big impact. But my problem with that is it's not dealing with, for example, what happened post-2008, the amount of poverty, the amount of suffering, the amount of loss. There's no one in like Joe Biden's government saying, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to have ordinary Americans comfortable in their own homes, own their own homes if that's the model that you want to go with, work with dignity if that's the model you want to go. That doesn't seem to be on the agenda. And so I wouldn't really call that left-wing in any sort of Marxist or economic sense at all.
Well, I think that here we have to distinguish goals from means. So the goals of having more people living in their own home, or the goal of having more people have work, right? There are a couple of different approaches to that. I think that we all hopefully share that goal. The question is the approaches. And there is sort of a broadly left-wing approach, which is the government takes capital, the government takes that money from people who have earned it or invested it, and takes it and then uses it to buy people homes or subsidize loans or hire people for jobs. That's sort of the left-wing top-down approach. And then there is the more conservative approach traditionally, which is you basically allow the free market to work, and then you incentivize people to make good decisions that allow them to get out of poverty more permanently. In other words, signing people a check is actually not a way of getting them out of poverty. It's a way of temporarily relieving poverty, but does not change any of the incentive structures that allow people to truly escape poverty in the long term. Those are two different approaches. I would say that on the show, when I speak about the left, one distinction that I make very frequently on the show are between people who I say are leftists and people who I say are liberals. People who I say are liberals are people who believe in bigger government and higher taxes and maybe nationalized healthcare, but who don't actually wish to shut down the debate and treat dissent as though it's a criminal act. And then there are people who are really hardcore on the left who wish to engage in those sorts of activities. So I try to make that distinction as much as possible, because I do think that the great danger, and we may be jumping out ahead of something else we're going to talk about, but I think one of the big dangers right now is that as the Overton window shuts, it's very difficult to have honest conversations about any of these topics without somebody jumping out of the woodwork and calling you a name, and then the debate shuts down. And if you even have this conversation, then you're going to get hit. I'm sure that, Russell, after we have this conversation, you're going to get hit with a wave of why would you even talk to that person, for example. And that sort of stuff happens fairly routinely. In fact, when I invite people on my show who disagree, I say to them beforehand, just recognize you're going to get a lot of texts from your friends being very angry that you took me up on that. But as far as sort of the broader rubric of trying to make life better for people, there are a bunch of different approaches to how you make life better for people. And I tend to take the approach that suggests that when you treat people as responsible individuals, capable of making decisions that better their lives, and you put the responsibility with the individual, with adult individuals to do that, that you are better off than if you treat them as basically just a pocket requiring being filled. And that's obviously not talking about people who have some sort of serious disability or are literally unable to take care of themselves.
I feel that both of those approaches have problems, and in a sense this is where I wonder if the spiritual values that we were talking about a little, if not in particular detail with regard to their the specificity of those values, but like for me, compassion, kindness, love, and look, when we touched upon the idea of like contemplation of how God would have us be, for me, in a sense, there is in the kind of sort of social Darwinism that underwrites a lot of free market ideology, natural competition, services, the market will look after itself. Like those kind of ideas for me are sort of like an aspect of like, I don't know, rationalism, say, should we call it, that I'm not particularly fond of, because it seems to me that it has unleashed a set of processes that are leading to individualism, commodification, a kind of a loss of meaning, a loss of purpose, and a side effect, a consequence of that, I would believe, is yes, economic poverty, but a kind of a deeper poverty still, a poverty of meaning. I don't think capitalism in alliance with conservatism can provide that kind of meaning. I sometimes query, Ben, whether even secularism can fulfill that role. So when I am mentioning, perhaps glibly in this context, given the breadth of your knowledge, when I talk about centralization, whether it's at a state level or an economic level, these sort of juggernauts of power with incredible influence that can shape and make the world to their convenience, I feel that these forces are largely, in both cases, whether you know, like it's sort of like neoliberal or leftist, statist kind of centralized redistribution models that I don't ever see as being particularly effective, and more focused on the kind of censorship and stuff that we've talked about, even though I'm sympathetic in a way that perhaps that you are less inclined to be, to the kind of, you know, that stuff about feelings. I was like, yeah, I kind of care about people's feelings, I guess, you know, and we can get into that a little bit if you want to. But more, what I'm sort of interested in is, how can we here now create a kingdom that is a reflection of, whether you believe in God or not, the kind of values that God is undergirded by, if one could ever come to such a conclusion. But perhaps in sort of terms of Sesame Street ethics, we could talk about love, oneness, kindness, allowing people to be who they are. And I don't see how free market capitalism is heading in that direction. Now, I'm not talking about you, like a self-made man building what looks like an enviable media empire. I'm talking about out of control power and financial power, particularly the type that you alluded to, and that is, you know, hand in glove with like lack of government regulation. So don't you agree with me, Ben, that neither of these options are in alignment with our higher principles? You know, you and I, as both as men who like self-declared men of God. And therefore, why are you out to bat so vociferously for one of those sides?
Right. So I think that I have a couple of points to make here. One,
I bet you do.
Yeah. One is that I think that, frankly, look, if you're looking for love in economics, you're looking for love in all the wrong places. What I mean by that is that economics is designed to generate wealth and innovation, right? The best economic systems are the ones that generate, presumably, the most wealth and the highest level of growth for populations broadly distributed. And certainly capitalism has done the job there. If you look at the global GDP or the GDP of any individual nation since 1800, it has risen exponentially with the increase of free trade and private property rights and free markets. And before then, the level of subsistence was extraordinarily high. In terms of living at subsistence level, life expectancy was extraordinarily low. In Europe, it was still below the age of 40 was the average life expectancy in the year 1800. Now everybody who's growing up in the West can expect to live 80 years in a level of wealth, even at the poverty line, that would be unimaginable to people who are middle class or even upper class in, say, 1900, right? We have devices available at our fingertips, even if you're very poor in Western societies. That would boggle the mind of somebody living in 1900. Like the richest guy in 1900 maybe had a couple of telephones. The guy now has more computing power in the palm of his hand being on welfare than NASA had putting a man on the moon. Right? That's the power of economics and the power of capitalism. But if you're looking for meaning in economics, I think that you're right to say that you can't find deeper meaning in economics. I will say that I think that if you read Adam Smith, and I don't mean just The Wealth of Nations, which a lot of people have referred to, I mean the theory of moral sentiments, he fully acknowledges that there has to be a moral underpinning to a recognition of individual human striving and individual human ability. So take it from this perspective. I know that by the way, there's a very rich debate, obviously, as you know, inside the religious community. If you read the writings of Francis right now versus the writings of Benedict, they're very different on economics, obviously, or certainly versus John Paul II. So, you know, my view of this is that when in Genesis God says that human beings are created in His image, and that when God suggests that we have the individual power to choose, as he suggests to Cain at the very beginning of Genesis, this is foisting responsibility on individuals. And you have power over your own life. You have power over your own labor. Now, if there's somebody who's oppressing you, that's a different story, right? If there's somebody who's literally oppressing you, then it is the job of government and others to step in and stop that person from oppressing you. But the idea that it is the government's job to provide some sort of utopian vision on earth, or that forced redistribution is the way to do that, seems to me to really be a moral problem that infringes fundamentally on your ability to choose, infringes on your creative abilities. And so the argument for free markets for me, capitalism is a term that frankly was coined by Marx to a certain extent, but the free market idea, which is really that you own your own labor and that you are able to alienate that labor, you're able to sell it, you are able to work with it and then use the products of that labor to buy other things. That comes down to fundamental human dignity in a way as well. And so my ideal is that everybody is able to own their own labor and alienate that labor as they see fit, and that they find meaning in the social connections that they make with others and in the way that they bring up their family. But I don't think that you can solve a spiritual problem with an economic answer, is I think what I would say here. And the reason I say that is because we are richer than any time in human history. And yet, as you are pointing out, a lot of people feel empty. A lot of people feel lack of meaning in their lives. A lot of people feel alienated from the culture. It would be very difficult to take a person from 2021, plunk them down in 1850 and say, are you better off materially in 1850 than you are in 2021? No one would take that trade. But forget about all of the other, various social issues ranging from race to sex in 1850. I'm just talking about just the pure material lifestyle. I think that it's important to recognize what economics can do and what economics can't. And when we think that economics can fill hearts as opposed to filling pockets, I think that we start to make a rather large-scale mistake.
If it is inhibited in the ways that you have outlined in its capacity to provide meaning, it ought that, in my view, be relegated to a less potent social role rather than occupying, as it does at the moment, the pinnacle, i.e. even the metrics, Ben, that you espouse, GDP, for example, are determined in accordance with the ideals of this particular, not necessarily science, but this set of ideals and rules and principles. I'm not suggesting that there could ever be one centralized body, although religiously, of course, you believe that there could be, and indeed is, that provides you with all of your meaning and your sort of personal and familial and professional regulatory systems. And, in your religious life, you believe that there is, and I feel like, I suppose in another way I do, but where perhaps we see things distinctly is I feel that there is a kind of an obligation to promote these values to the forefront of our lives to the point where these sort of somewhat gooey terms like compassion and kindness are prized above economic growth and GDP, and like the fact that these sort of regulatory measures are the sort of the dominant means for evaluating our culture, I think that give us a set of biases that I think might be very, very difficult to overthrow. And I feel that by having like the false markers of scientific, technological and economic growth as the determinants for progress, we fall into a trap that neglects great vast territories of unimagined endeavour that could alter the human experience. I feel that what I have, Ben, is a kind of deep optimism that we can create different worlds, and part of that might be finding ways to curtail the potency of some of the Goliaths of the tech, economic and even older energy-based sort of behemoths of economics. Also, though, I acknowledge the many areas where we have to look at and recognise that no one wants to revisit the failings of 20th century, communism, fascism, all of those dead late industrialist ideas shouldn't be revived, can't be revived, but I feel that there is something within us, and I feel that it lies currently in the domain of the religion and it needs to be released from there and allowed to become a dominant cultural force, not an oppressive one, but
things that I think is so fun about this is that we're kind of going deeper and deeper under the waterline, and I think that's great, because I think that one of the things that you just said there is something where we do sort of disagree about the fundamental nature of optimism with regard to human capacities.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that part of my conversation with Ben Shapiro. There is another hour available on Luminary as an audio podcast, and you can get it from Apple or you can get it from Luminary. You can get it on Apple wherever you are in the world. It's another hour of conversation between Ben and I. It gets very, very interesting and pretty intense. So if you're interested in hearing that, go over and subscribe to Luminary, which I've said you can get from Apple. Thanks very much. If you enjoyed that podcast, please like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, go over at russellbrand.com and sign up to the mailing list. And remember, I'm doing live shows at the moment. There are tickets available. Go to my web site for those. And also, I've got a live streaming Shakespeare show. Yeah, me doing Shakespeare, talking about life. It's pretty amazing, which is available on Live Now. Details for all this stuff is on my russellbrand.com website. Thanks.